Hi, welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. And I'm Noel, I'm your host. I'm joined by two great guests today from an organization or connected to an organization that I've had on before, which is called Thrive. Damien's here as head of their training, and Bex is here as one of their successful graduates who works in using therapeutic horticulture within a mental health setting, NHS mental health setting with young people. And so we're going to get a really interesting insight into this thing. And for those that don't know about therapeutic horticulture, well, I'm sure Damien will be able to tell us all about it because he's the training bod. So I'm sure he's got that down pat. My own personal experience of it is that, and I was saying to you just before the show, my background was in inpatient work with long-term care hospitals, the sort that don't exist anymore, sort of thankfully. And that's where I first came across the idea of horticulture therapy. And I have a horticulture therapist who works for my own company and has done, extraordinary things. And I was very sort of glad to see that Thrive existed when I discovered you. And because it's about time it was formalized, all this training and all the evidence for it was brought together and we started using these things. Most people know how valuable nature is and how valuable gardening is. And if you don't, you're just about to learn. And if you're not involved in this, you're silly. You've got a really, really free form of therapy, which is called gardening. I don't know why you're not doing it, but there you go. So enough of me. Damien, do you want to sort of tell us about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So it's a real pleasure to be on the show. I've been at Thrive for just over 15 years now. So I've really relished the opportunity to have a career at Thrive. And at Thrive, we do all sorts of different things. We have three gardens around the UK that support people with ill health and disability directly, with close to 300 people a week coming across those services. But we also try and promote the whole use of therapeutic horticulture and social and therapeutic horticulture in the UK. And I'm involved in providing all sorts of training days from entry level ones all the way up to our accredited diploma that Bex is a graduate. And we also do all sorts of interesting work where we support individual organizations. Some of these can be relatively small charities, community interest groups who are starting up, but also with larger partners as well, trying to make sure that we work in a way that develops the professional standards of what we see as an emerging profession. And so there's a team of five of us at Thrive in the training team who look after all of this work. And like I say, after 15 years, I feel really quite privileged to have been involved for so long, and to have watched it develop and grow as it definitely has over the last decade or so.
Super. You're one of the seedlings that have taken root and grown into something solid yourself. So, Bex, tell us about you. What's your connection with all this?
So I work for the NHS. I'm an occupational therapy assistant. I did at an adolescent mental health hospital. I did a couple of Thrive shorter trainings, and yeah, just got really interested in that way. And then I've just graduated from the diploma last year.
Great. And
So
the work that you're doing is recognized within the hospital and the trust setting. They sort of value it.
yeah, so I work for the occupational therapy department, and since graduating, I've managed to set up like a weekly session um, within the within our therapeutic timetable. So I'm using
Super.
it in that way.
It's great. I mean, it's sort of great to see it. I guess for me, it's great to see it coming back because I think there were some things that were lost from the closure of those hospitals, and this is one of them. I think one of those treatments that isn't a treatment, that is a treatment when it's done properly, it is really helpful for people's sort of health and well-being. I'm always interested in how people sort of get into these areas. And Damien, where do you come from? Are you sort of, what's your background? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So, I came into it after essentially working in mental health settings. So I worked in various different sort of medium and high secure forensic settings, predominantly
Mhm.
large institutions. Like you say, Noel, it's very true. As some of these larger institutions changed, quite rightly so, there were some valuable things that were going on in those settings that in some way got lost. And every single hospital I ever walked into had some form of therapeutic horticulture, usually under the guise of occupational therapy, because that's the professional sort of team who look after that sort of side of things in those sorts of settings. And obviously, they have great skills already because a good amount of it is about the occupation. And so I watched it and I watched individuals, I watched lots of patients essentially do better by going to the garden than talking to us as
Yeah,
they were supposed
yeah,
to. And there was clearly something valuable about the views, but also something valuable about the occupation of looking after a garden.
great.
And so that's
What was
why I
your
started when the
what was
chance
your
to work.
background before mental health, Damien? How did
I
you get involved in that?
I'm a psychologist by background, and so it's was my first career. I mean, I did
Right.
a little bit of retail work when I was a teenager, but other than that, I've worked in mental health settings, and then I've come and worked for Thrive. Um,
Were the reasons why you're attracted to mental health? I know my routine was through the arts, actually, because I grew up in Birmingham and I grew up in a family where it was quite unstable, actually. And I found in the arts a lot of things that helped me personally a lot in terms of developing the social skills that I wasn't getting from being in a dysfunctional family, etc. And approval. I really enjoyed people clapping me when I was on stage. That was really nice. I still like that, I have to say. Where did you grow up? What was the sort of your background?
I'm not sure that, as a teenager, I had any real strong desire to do
Really?
anything much than avoid work a little bit. And so,
Very
um, you
normal
know,
teenager.
Well, it's a common story, isn't
Yeah,
it? I think sometimes, we're pushed a little bit too soon in life to try and make important choices. And so
yeah,
luckily I had parents who just wanted me to be happy. And they were parents that gardened, they were parents that were interested in generally being good and kind to folk. And so it seemed like a reasonable pathway if I was going to take any, I guess. But instantly, I found working in mental health settings incredibly interesting.
right.
Um, I found that spending a lot of time in company of other people essentially was something that I wanted to do in my working life. I didn't want to be somebody isolated. I didn't want to be somebody in an industrial estate where I didn't, I wanted somewhere that was felt like an environment that was interesting to me, that would keep me wanting to learn and being interested. And I essentially found um, that I was able to connect to a lot of people that I still think about, and essentially who, through the work I did, ended up nourishing me as well.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's interesting. There is these days, I don't know, I'm thinking back to my training, which was a long time ago. I think we're sort of similar types of generations, Damien, I'm going to guess.
Yes, yeah, I would
I'm
think.
guessing we are. And when I trained, for example, I was the only guy on my training course. Everybody else was a woman, and that was the traditional messages. So I'm intrigued always when I see guys who get involved in mental health and what, rather than the medical side, like psychiatric work, is still quite dominated by men. But the psychological therapies side of things isn't. The psychology side of things is still the gender balances elsewhere. So was there a particular interest that you had that sort of spurred you on, or was it sort of just again just accidental, which it
I
often is?
think to some extent it was a little bit more accidental to begin
Right.
with. I mean, I became more involved in the training side within those sorts of settings because obviously there's lots of mandatory training, lots of induction. And so I did a teaching diploma at some point when I was in mental health services and got involved in all of that side of things, and realized again that that essentially you know working with people who are all generally altruistic and trying to do the best they can in the system, was a real pleasure to be involved in. Feeling as
Yeah.
is in some way you give people the tools or the resources to to exist within those settings and be as successful as you can be in those settings, because there is always an element of trying to cope with the system. And I sort of appreciate, I sort of felt that I enjoyed supporting others. So the move to Thrive was one that I was able to take both from that sort of developing my educational side of things, my teaching side of things, but also because essentially I'd been, I learned to garden through my parents, and watching it in a therapeutic setting just made so much sense. And like I say, I started to feel that it was a more useful thing in many situations. And so, yeah, felt that it was something that I wanted to become
Right.
increasingly involved in.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I'm going to come back to some of the terms you use, like I worked in forensic settings, almost like, oh yeah, that's right. We'll just skip over that. When I come back to that, that's all right. Because I think it's quite important that people understand that what you're doing in Thrive and the idea of working with gardening and working with nature is a very serious professional endeavor. It's not silly. There's a lot of evidence for it, and the people involved in it are committed professionals who've often spent a long time in the field and have seen these things. And I think there's some interesting questions about the transfer of some of those things from institutions into the community. And it's been a bit of a lag, but it seems to be happening, which is nice to see. So I'm really happy to see that. But I want to come to Bex and then come back to you with some of those questions, if that's all right, Damien. Bex, what's your background? Where did you grow up then? Is it sort of
Yeah, I mean, I sort of similar to Damien, was like, I'm not sure what to do as a teenager, and I was like, well, I like I like expressive arts and art, so
right.
I actually trained in design for theatre and film, so it's completely unrelated to what I do now, but I feel like there's transferable
Yeah,
sort of skills there from the creativity aspect of it. So that supports in sort of running groups where I am at the moment.
right.
Yeah, I worked backstage in various different theatres, toured the
Did you?
UK,
Right.
worked in the West End, and then sort of got as far as I wanted to go there, and then I had to think, and I retrained. So I retrained to work in mental health.
It's
Um,
not unusual in theatre, actually. I mean, it's really that was my background in the arts. Was I was more on the acting, on the stage side of things, as you can probably guess from my personality right now. But then there was I had a sense in which I became more interested in people
yeah,
from
yeah,
that work, and then I began to run out of skills, because it was in the days when you did theatre and education, and we were looking at theatre in different venues and looking at how those skills were life skills, and retraining people who'd come out of institutional care with new skills and all that sort of stuff. And then I discovered that I didn't know what I was doing. That wasn't okay anymore. I'm not sure I do know what I'm doing, even though I'm qualified, but I think I make it up better than I used to. Do you know what I mean? So what attracted you, do you think, to mental health as it? I mean, it's sort of most, I can see the link immediately. I know it, I feel it, I've lived it.
yeah.
But tell us a bit, can you try and make that explicit so that people understand that link for you?
I think for me, because working in theatre, you're constantly working with new people all
Yeah.
the time, and I've got quite a curious mind. I like to get to know people, and sort of, yeah, a bit of a people watcher as well. So it's kind of from that aspect, it just kind of, yeah, just became interested in people and what kind of makes people who they are, and from there it kind of.
And why do you think the creativity helps? Apart from the practical stuff, you know how to run groups and you can sort of make things up and improvise and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
What would you say is the link? Can you see a link between creativity and mental wellness, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everyone should spend some time being creative in some form,
Yeah.
and that can obviously come in all different ways. But as Damien knows, I love a tangent, so I like to make links. We've he's spent many tutorials with me. Yeah, I like to I kind of link things together, and I feel like that kind of benefits me as well,
Yeah.
and kind of thinking about things from all different angles as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so I feel like
I mean, it's actively a skill we promote in people, isn't it? That shift from left to right brain to the
yeah,
creative links, the bigger picture, hovering above and seeing the
yeah,
broad and making those accidents that are really helpful in
yeah,
life. Also, and I wonder what both of you think about this. And this is my experience, I guess, personally and professionally, as somebody who's had struggles around psychological distress at various times in life. That creative approaches are sort of like the opposite of the illness, if you like. The illness is not creative at all. It's the sort of when I'm depressed, there aren't many creative thoughts going on. I'm locking down the sense of choice reduces inside my head, and the more I can do something that opens that up, the better it is for me. What would you see is the sort of links there for yourself? What have you experienced?
yeah. I mean, I feel like being creative is like a form of connection. So
Yeah,
you're connecting to the moment, you're connecting to yourself and the emotions that might be coming up for you, or it's like a form of processing as well. I feel
yeah.
it helps to process thoughts that you might not feel able to talk about at the time, but you can express them in another way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are built that way as human beings, as social animals.
Yeah,
We're built in that way. I think, my feeling is we have far too much belief in the power of our conscious mind as more than what it is, which is something that's quite useful, but a very small part of ourselves, to be honest, when it comes down to it. Damien, I wonder if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your background. You said you worked in institutional care within, I guess you come from that belief that those communities were therapeutic communities in and of themselves. Some people find that confusing, don't they? The inpatient hospital setting. So would you mind discussing that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I started working in such settings around about 1998, something like that.
Yeah,
So, and I worked in, some fairly large sort of hospitals, and visited lots of different larger institutions that still existed at that time. And they was, even in the 90s, they were still essentially overcoming some of the horrors of the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And so they were places that had to change, and they were changing. And one of the biggest changes in my time was the recovery movement. It was something that had only just been really tapped into in the UK when I first came along. And by the time I left 15 years ago, it's pretty much the definition for the Royal College of Nursing mental health definition is one based more on the recovery model than the old institutional one. So I watched a lot of it change. But obviously that change is slow, and there were elements within those settings, like you say, that essentially were therapeutic community based.
yeah,
And, but people are, sometimes detained against their will in these places under the Mental Health Act. But sometimes, actually, although people are, legally detained, actually, they're perfectly quite comfortable within that setting because, to some extent, that setting for particularly people who experience some of the worst approaches to mental health care, they acted to some extent as a sanctuary.
yeah.
You're provided with meals, you've got a bed, and the basics of life at least are taken care of. Now, obviously, that's notwithstanding the things that go wrong in those places and the things that people intentionally do wrong in those places as well. But there were elements, and a big element of it was that maybe occupation in those settings didn't feel so clinical because it wasn't just being done by occupational therapy. And some of the normalization of occupation sometimes I think got lost over that
Mm.
transition. And within every hospital I ever worked in, there was some form of garden. And many of them originated as kitchen gardens,
Yes,
probably
that's right. Yeah.
for financial reasons in the Victorian period at places like Bethlehem and things like this, in order to essentially feed the population,
And
and things.
sometimes more than that, sometimes to make money for the hospital.
Yeah, and
I've
sometimes,
worked in hospitals where the garden was
yes,
selling produce locally as well. So,
yes. So not necessarily always for altruistic purposes, but I think that you can probably find, and there has been little bits of investigation into the history of it. You can find that those places, pretty much were always being used in some way by some people in a therapeutic way. It
Yeah.
was being thought of in that way. You can find it described in that way in the Victorian Pavilion Hospital movement, things like this. So when I was working in some of those larger institutions, forensic settings, you're working with people who essentially are unwell at a level where any sort of difficulty with the law that they've been tangled up in is essentially being described as because of mental ill health.
Yeah.
And so people
People
are,
should just be aware forensic means pertaining to the criminal justice system.
yes, that's
So
right.
that's how you get to know them, right?
Yes, but essentially, and it's always, always important to sort of mention, isn't it, that if you're experiencing mental health distress, if you're experiencing mental health distress at a level that it's being sort of described as ill health, then actually you're much more likely to be the victim of
The
crime.
victim rather than perpetrator, without a
Of
doubt. I
course,
mean,
yeah, and
we're talking about a very niche group of people that,
yes, but they are a niche group of people. But without doubt, some of the only solace that you can provide to people who experience schizophrenia and things like this at a level that is almost resistant to any approach that to change it is you can garden and
yeah,
people can find respite in that space. People can find a new way of existing, a new identity for themselves. All of these important things, along with the exercise, along with the vitamin D, along with the other evolutionary advantages of spending time in a green space. And it just became so obvious to me in those settings that this is something that's really valuable and needs to be a tool or resource that's properly utilized for the good that it can do to both the
wonder if
individual
you know
and the
about this. You may
the
or may
whole.
not. I mean, my background is in local authorities as well, and in safety and safe communities, and a lot of people don't know about this, so it's fine if you don't. But the police often will, for example, invest money in parks in urban areas because it's well researched that around the perimeter of park, violent crime drops by 20% just simply when you have a park. Um,
Yeah,
because of
absolutely.
that sense of connection it produces between people without the need for conscious thought. And this is the important thing. And I think one of the interesting things about looking at that translation from those heavy-ended institutions to now is that these approaches, particularly the therapeutic garden approaches, were working with people whose cognitive processes were damaged to the point where you weren't going to learn about this stuff. So something else had to be going on, right?
Yeah.
And something important and useful was going on. And I think there's that. What is that useful and important thing that's going on, do you think, other than, the very simplistic surface stuff of you're exercising and all this sort of stuff? We all know that that's important, but it's something more existential, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it's essentially, I think, about identity and how you perceive yourself. And I think
Right.
connection with nature gives you an opportunity to see yourself in a much more positive light. I think that, there essentially is something quite special about nurturing other life. And that can be difficult for some people in a social situation, but it can be very easy to nurture other plant life or
I
other.
think that nails it, Damien. It
And I
really
think
does, yeah.
that, and it's that relationship that you develop with nature that is then supportive of a maintenance of wellness, because you're constantly thinking about looking after something.
Yeah.
And, we're, like you said, we're social animals. We need to be looking after things because it's in our evolution to do so. And so that can be tricky with people sometimes, particularly when we're experiencing mental distress and things like this. But a plant is non-judgmental. If you
That's
do
right.
the right things,
That's right.
it will
Yeah,
grow.
I've never met a tomato that has any prejudice yet.
Yeah, it's
Do you know what I
beautiful.
mean?
That
I've
feedback.
searched all my life, never found one. That's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the reasons why psychological distress, disability, etc., are difficult and challenging are these antisocial aspects to them. The isolation that comes because of either people's attitudes or because of access issues, or because, you know, sometimes psychological distress looks frightening and looks confusing and people shy away from it. Um, Bex, I wonder from your perspective, thinking about it and like working with young people and young people coming into some form of institutional care, they're in a tough place. If they're in an institution, it's not
Yeah.
an easy life they're having, is it? Do you know what I
No.
mean? So, tell us a bit of, without naming where you do, how you got involved in that, what that's all about, and why, as an occupational therapist, you think it's important to bring this stuff into your work. But important enough to invest time and money, your own time and money, in learning about it, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of yeah, as I said, I've always been sort of spending time in nature myself and understanding the benefits of it. And I just feel like bringing that to the hospital is like it's another way of supporting people that, like Damien said, there's no judgment. If you're up with other people, you could be quite vulnerable, but if you're engaging with nature, it's like you're getting benefit from it by passively enjoying it as well. Like, you don't need to be active in what you're doing. So from like an occupational therapy perspective, obviously engaging in meaningful activity and yeah, is incredibly beneficial. But you can do that through spending time in the garden as well. And
Yeah.
I feel that, I mean, there's a lot of research into being in hospital and being in that unnatural environment can have a negative effect on your mental health as well. So
There's
being
a
out
whole
in
thing
nature
called biophilic design, isn't there,
is
about
yeah.
making architecture more natural, if you like, and adding nature into it to get that sort of response. In terms of the young people that you, as a professional, how do they? I mean, I'm just trying to imagine a teenager being told they're going to do a bit of gardening. Like, what?
I,
Actually, I loved doing gardening when I was a kid. My stepdad taught me about. I told you the story about when I discovered the stalks that Brussels sprouts go on. And folks, if you've not seen Brussels sprouts in the wild, it will blow your mind. If you've only ever seen them in string bags at Christmas, go and have a look at a real Brussels sprout on its stalk. And I was like, I remember seeing that as a kid and just going, "What?" I mean, it's like comic. My eyes popped out, do you know, like that. So, what are the kids like? Are the young people? Sorry, that
yeah, I mean,
you hop along. We're going to do some gardening.
it really varies. So some people are up for it, some people not so much.
Right.
But sort of, I can just like, you don't have to engage if you don't want to. You just come out and spend time with us. So you're still getting that sort of social connection with people. And then after a while, they'll start to engage and they'll do stuff. And just it's seeing the awe and wonder in them as well when they're sort of learning around, like, oh, the seedling's growing and it's following the sun, and that kind of aspect of it is amazing to see. A lot of comments of, oh, that session went really quickly.
Yeah.
And then, oh, if it might not be that they're, maybe we do, so for whatever reason we can't go out in the garden, it's bringing that inside and still
Yeah.
connecting in that way. Or it might be a case of, we're going to connect to nature through, doing something based around textile. So it's something that they're interested in, but we can bring in textile elements to that as well, or being creative, or maybe we're going to make little, like little miniature gardens or fairy gardens, and it's not just connecting the people, like they aren't just connecting with themselves around the activity. You hear a lot of stories around, oh, my grandparents used to grow this, or so it kind of brings up nice memories for them as well, of them connecting with people in their family in the past and as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, it really varies, but it kind of, you have to, so I'll have an idea of what I'm going to do through this season, but it'll change, and I have to adapt based on their interests and what risk, or there's a lot of different elements that you have to.
What do you think? What do you see happen in the young people who do engage? What sort of do you see happening?
Seeing a lot of benefits in sort of emotional regulation, really. So it might be, they might not be feeling very good, but they know through our sessions that going outside will benefit them, or going outside and doing some digging or something like that. So it's sort of, they get that physical exercise aspect to it and being outside. And a lot of, I mean, I think Damien touched on it earlier, sort of, you'll have conversations that you wouldn't necessarily have in like a clinical. They feel more comfortable outside to kind of talk about how they're feeling, and while engaged in something and connecting, because obviously there's research into how it can lower your stress levels, like physiologically the benefits of nature are really positive. So I feel like that and engaging in activities that help them regulate, they're then able to kind of speak a bit more around how they're feeling. So.
And we should point out to people there is a ton of research around this. It is just so. I mean, another one of my team is a nature therapist. She's just done her training. She's a CAMS nurse actually, as well as a cat psychotherapist, and now she's just trained as a wilderness therapist, and she's doing work in CAMS teams, campsite child and adolescent mental health services in sort of wilderness courses for young people who. And one of the interesting things, and again, coming back to thinking about some of the people that you and I have worked with and that you've worked with, Bex, but maybe not so much as the old dogs like me and Damien that's worked in just long-term institutional care. We were talking about people who I saw this happen a lot, actually. People who I, as a person, would see and think, I'm not sure there's much hope for that person because some people were in a grim state. And then they'd be doing some of this stuff. They'd go into the garden and I'd see a different person, a person I would never see as a clinician, ever. That the patient who presented to me as a clinician was a particular type of person who was in that relationship to me, and then I'd go and observe them in the garden or indeed in one of the other occupational therapy groups, maybe an art therapy group, etc., etc. And I'd see a totally different person I didn't know existed, and that was such a startling experience. Damien, you want to say something about that? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's you literally do see people change through just
Yeah.
simply going into a garden. I mean, like you say, there is really strong evidence, and the evidence comes from a range of different academic disciplines, which in some ways makes the development of the professions under that heading of nature-based interventions that you would find wilderness therapy, as well as what we do in social and therapeutic horticulture, care farming, ecotherapy, and these
Yeah.
different things. And there's a great resource, either Natural England's review of nature-based interventions in mental
Yeah.
health, or the Green Care Conceptual Framework, both of them freely available on Google. And you can see all of these different things. And it's really fascinating how nature-based interventions are emerging across Europe and across the world.
Yeah.
But the actual reality, if we get this right, is so many people get this opportunity to just get 5 minutes of connection with nature. If we can get everybody to understand that just 5 minutes time in a green space will improve mood
Yeah.
instantly, then that's great. We can get people now to, we can sort of see the dose about 2 hours a week, and the benefits of
Yeah.
just simply being in that space start to plateau.
Yeah.
And that evidence is there. But the reality is that you see people who are people are different, and we all recognize it when we walk down a canal footpath or through the
Yeah.
park. We start saying hello to each other. We relax. Everybody relaxes and just calms a little bit because we're in an environment that our evolution built us for. But for example, I've seen a number of different individual people. One of my fond memories of working with a couple of people who really struggled on the ward together in the unit, because one of them was quite sort of chaotic. One of them really wanted order. And essentially they didn't get on because coffee
Of
was being
course.
spilt when coffee shouldn't be spilt, and
That's right.
watching Cash in the Attic again. Um, it's these issues of communal living in these units sometimes that the garden protects us from, just
Yeah.
like communal living in our own family groups, friendship groups. And that 5 minutes in a garden is just enough. And we just spend a bit of time being different. And so if we go out there with others, we'll be different. And these two people who didn't get on the unit, literally trying to fight with each other sometimes. In the garden, it would be, oh, pass me the secateurs, please.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
most polite, gentle relationship when they were in the garden together. Back
Yeah.
on the unit, and the issues of communal living would straight away become difficult for them. Others I've seen just simply through over a longer period of time, I've seen people literally recover enough for us to begin conversations with very, very difficult
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
weren't coming out of their rooms for weeks and weeks on end. Just a view of nature enough to improve mood, enough to then enable that conversation and begin to, encourage people to make more of a connection with nature as part of their recovery. And you see it in real time, in those settings all of the time.
So can I ask you a question? It's maybe a more technical question for both of you, and really it's more impressionistic than anything. So there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is the the role that occupational therapy has always had and continues to have, a filtering in practice that then becomes formalized. It's a sort of happened with all the arts therapies, for example. They started off in occupational therapy teams and then they became professions themselves. So you now have music, dance. I better get them all. Otherwise, they'll shoot me.
Yeah. Play therapy.
Drama.
Yeah, but whatever, all of them.
Yeah.
I've covered them all. Sorry. Um, and a similar thing is happening now, it seems, possibly that this is coming in via various routes. There's an interesting question, I guess, for me as a clinician. I think the limits and the benefits of clinical work are exactly this, that somehow the part of the outputs of clinical work is the capacity to communicate what it is that you've learned from the clinician in some way and demonstrate it in some way called evidence. And maybe that's cognition, maybe that's cognitive, maybe that's written, maybe that's something like that, whatever the outcome is, the output. But it seems to me that, and I want to ask you both to think about this and give me an answer that would it be temporary to this show? Is it necessary, that output from this type of work? Or is the fact that somebody feels better because they're in a garden, is that enough?
Why don't I go first? Because it's a question I've been asked before, so I sort of have an answer, and it'll give Bex a little bit of time to think it through. Because it is a tough question.
Yeah.
What I would say is that when we use social and therapeutic horticulture, we are using essentially a multimodal approach, which is time in nature, time being occupied, and time in a social environment. And those three things come together to support the outcomes we see in all of this great evidence that's starting to come together. Okay, but the actual experience for each individual is much more holistic.
Hmm.
And so we're being asked to demonstrate certain outcomes, just like other clinicians, maybe not at the same standard as other clinicians at the moment as an emerging profession, but we are getting there slowly.
Yeah.
But the experience for each individual is much more holistic. And I think that, it's important for practitioners in this area to maintain that awareness of the holistic way in which individuals benefit so that you can be there with them in the moment as they're expressing it.
Yeah.
Because if you're too caught up on this specific outcome that's been written in a smart way in order to be accountable and demonstrable, which we all should be to some extent, it's for the actual person experiencing it is not as important as the ongoing conversation between practitioner and client gardener as we would describe them,
Okay.
where we take a fuller appreciation of the holistic ways and the personal ways in which that outcome plays out in that person's life within their community.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. I mean, there's a couple of points I want to come back to. Bex, what would you say in answer to
Yeah,
that question?
I mean, David's kind of pretty much covered it really. But I think it's that thing of like subjective and objective. Like we've just been saying about how you can see a difference in someone when they spend time in the garden. Yeah, and that will vary throughout their time, specific like for me at the hospital. So it's sort of you can see an impact depending on how they were before they went into the garden and afterwards, which it might be you might see something different on another day when they're feeling better. So there's so many variables involved. I mean, there is evidence for like physiological responses to spending time in the garden. So if you wanted to, to sort of measure it in that way, then there's that. But I feel there's too many variables for me.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess one of my strong feelings about it is that always in this work, we have to come back to the person who's experiencing it and ask them, you know. My background in psychological therapies and that stuff. I'm old enough to have been trained in methods that I no longer believe in, and I think are probably disreputable. So I'm a very much an evidence-based practitioner, without a doubt. And it's really for me about accountability more than anything else. The evidence base there is to be accountable so that when somebody comes to me and I say I'm going to do something, I deliver. And people have a right to know that. They have a right to know what the outcomes are and what they're going to get from something. And I think that's fair enough, to be honest. But also within that, and which is why I'm excited to have you folks on, that we don't lose this self-directed human who
Yeah.
has some needs in here that we can't necessarily define, but are really important. And it just seems bizarre that we don't know that nature's going to give it that to us. How could we not know that somehow? It's like our closest partner on the earth,
Well,
literally.
it could well be that it's because, from an evolutionary perspective, it's happened in the blink of an eye. We've
Yes.
come disconnected in literally, probably, on real worldwide scale. You're looking at the last 30, 40 years that some of the world
Yes.
is urbanized,
Yeah. That's
not in
right.
our own society. That's going back to Victorian and industrial revolution times when we start to urbanize. And so there are some families who move to the cities and maybe have been city dwellers for a few generations now, but it has happened quickly. And so some of the disconnect perhaps is just not recognized yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but thankfully there's enough signs out there that the message is becoming clearer for people,
Yeah.
and it's out
Yeah.
there in discussion and every day. It would be, the COVID pandemic brought it, front and center for
Right. Yes.
enough of time, perhaps, for the
Yeah.
general population to realize that, spending time in nature, connecting with nature, whether that be through gardening or cycling through the woods, or a trip to the beach, however you connect to nature is the best way to do it. We were talking earlier about, how Bex would arrange activities and how teenagers respond to gardening. If gardening is just in its traditional format, then it can be quite difficult to encourage people to garden. But if you're able to sort of explain what you mean by therapeutic gardening or gardening at your place, this is what we do. Do a lot of work with, dementia and elderly care
Yeah.
settings. And if you go in
Exactly.
there, say, who's up for some gardening? They're all thinking double digging and straightening edges on the lawn, and
Yeah.
they're retired and they don't do that anymore. But if I say, let's take some cuttings of African violets, everyone's up for it because everybody wants a new African violet on their
Yeah.
windowsill
Absolutely.
next and things like this. And so, it's best to think of it as a style of gardening that is unique. Do it the way that's right for you, take the performance pressure off. And that's there for the general population. What we're doing is a little bit like dietitians. We're taking something that is vital and important for everyone and just guiding people through a reconnection with it. Just like a dietitian would if somebody, suddenly has Crohn's or an issue that needs a little bit more specific attention to how we sort of gain a dose of that vitamin. Yeah, so it's really interesting the way that, it's something that is there for everyone and not clinical. Because of it, it's normalized, and I think that makes a difference to how we work within settings and the evidence base and things like that. But of course, the individual experience is so important because it varies so drastically because we all have different affinities for nature in the first place.
And also, I think, and we're going to finish on this, and I want you to tell us about Thrive and how people can get hold of you and the courses that you do and all that sort of stuff. But I'm interested as a person, as a clinician, in how we promote approaches to living that promote well-being, psychological well-being, physical well-being, etc. I don't really see the distinction between the two. And also treatment modalities that are also, as well as treatment, they provide prevention because prevention is so much better than cure all the time. And I don't need to tell you to this, but we spend far too much on treating things that are perfectly avoidable. We have to shift that balance. We really do. And that's in lifestyle medicine, really. I think that's where it's at. And I would see that as part of this movement. So tell me about what Thrive sort of generally offers, how people can get hold of you, the sort of client base that you have, because you've mentioned sort of some gardens that you have, which could be, how do people get involved? Who are the commissioners? Who are the people that you get referrals from, etc., etc.?
Sure. So Thrive have sort of three different services that we provide, if you like, charitable services. One is that we have three gardens around the UK: Reading, London, and Birmingham.
Yeah.
And in those settings, people are referred from either local authority care or from healthcare.
So that
Some
would be a GP or a psych ward, which,
some from GPs, but some also from clinical commissioning of specific programs.
okay.
And so, each week around about getting close to 300 people are coming through these three different gardens,
Mhm.
or 300 sessions in total are being delivered across these three different gardens. And so, predominantly we're working with people with a defined need, if you like.
Yeah.
However, we are just three of anything up to maybe 3,000 gardens that are working in some way therapeutically. There's likely definitely 1,000 out there. There could be anything up to 3,000. There's a really good resource that Dr. Richard Claxton put together called Gardening for Health. If
Yeah.
you search Gardening for Health online, you'll find a directory of therapeutic horticulture and other nature-based interventions online. And that advocacy work of trying to get people to realize that you should be able to access nature for your health no matter where you live in UK. That's part of Thrive strategy, essentially. It's one of the core parts of our strategies. It shouldn't matter where you live, SDH should be available to you. And so that's sort of part of my side of the work, where we provide all sorts of short course program training courses. You can find these on our website, entry level stuff. There's free sample stuff and loads of information to help you get learning about it before you have to pay a penny. And then all the way up to our diploma that Bex is the student of the year graduate. Bex wouldn't, well, there you go. She's smiling because she's telling everyone that. But Bex was student
I
of the
hope
year.
she's tied down because she looks like she's going to
Absolutely
be a runner if you keep talking like that.
Yeah,
So all
absolutely
good.
outstanding work that she did. And that's a proper higher education diploma, 120 credits
Brilliant.
over years, incredible work. And there we're looking at the nuance and the real nitty gritty. Bex would be able to converse on psychotherapy now after we sort of introduce Carl Rogers and person-centered approach and the importance of those sorts of things. And so, all of the different
That's
angles.
quite remarkable, teaching an occupational therapist about psychotherapy.
Yeah, there you go.
There's real
Well,
hope for the world, mate.
we also have to teach them a bit of occupational therapy, or how therapy works in a garden, because you asked that question earlier. There is a slightly unique nature to all different occupations, aren't there?
Yeah.
You recognize more in occupational therapy, and then they started recognizing their process is important, which I think it is as well. It's not to knock OT, but that's why I think these other things have emerged around it, because there is a need for that person who really understands the medium, the actual, whether it be a
Yeah.
creative, whether it be a more occupational one. So we advocate and we train and what have you. But then the other thing that's really valuable to all of your listeners probably is our Get Gardening service and our
Okay.
garden. Anybody can join the Thrive Gardening Club. Anybody can access our Get Gardening information. And soon they might be able to access our Cultivating Wellbeing app.
Brilliant.
Okay, so these are
Brilliant.
services we offer to general, to everybody in the UK and further afield. People all over the world tune in to Thrive, in order to basically say, let's get gardening. It's good for everyone, and that preventative side of things. A lifetime of strong connection with nature can be one of the things that is the hallmark of a very healthy life.
Yeah.
And if we can encourage more and more people to do that, then that's better. And our Get Gardening, our garden club, it's all Thrive stuff. It's all in this lovely ethos of let's not pressure ourselves here, people. Let's enjoy connecting with nature. And
Yeah.
yes, sometimes that's about being good to wildlife and things like that, but we try not to get too stressed on the specifics of how you do that. And so all of our info service comes with as little pressure as possible. Get Gardening, our Thrive Gardening Club, and soon to be released Cultivating Wellbeing, using gardening as an app.
And this is all available via your website, I guess?
Yes, so thrive.org.uk, and you'd be able to find all of it.
Great. Suddenly there's some light on you. You've gone completely dark over there, Damien. You suddenly lit up when you were checking on your computer.
I was just closing something down. Yeah, sorry.
So look, really wonderful to have you both on. And thank you so much for your time. And again, apologies, I made them wait for me, folks. I was caught up in something and they very kindly hung on, even though we started recording later. Remember, folks, this is a recording, so don't call me during the show when it goes out, because I'll be doing something else probably, and I might get a bit grumpy with you. But do send me a message and I can pass them on. So 07506 319 745. WhatsApp is probably best. I'm happy to pass them on to Damien Bex. Thanks to both of you for coming on. It's a subject that's very close to my heart. This idea of encouraging people in what are, I think, naturally healthy endeavors, really. And I've spent many years learning how not to kill plants. And I'm very proud of myself when I manage not to. It's sort of like there's a whole category of plants called "We Can't Be Killed by Noel." So but you can go and see us at your local horticulture centre. So really lovely to have you on. I wish you all lovely evening for the rest of your evening, and thanks everybody for tuning in. You stay there for now, folks. Hope you enjoyed this. Do check out Thrive's website. It's an amazing service. It really is extraordinary, and get your fingers green, folks. It's great for everybody, including yourself. So see you all next week, and thanks for watching.